Detective James Carter had seen his fair share of corruption in the justice system, but nothing prepared him for what happened that day in Judge Amanda Holloway's courtroom. The air was thick with tension as he stepped inside, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He wasn't there as a witness, nor as an investigator. He was there to speak the truth. But truth wasn't something Judge Holloway cared much for. She sat on the bench like a queen on her throne, her expression cold and unreadable. A woman of power, feared by many, yet known for her ruthless and questionable rulings. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. Amanda Holloway didn't serve justice. She played with it. And now she had her sights set on humiliating James Carter. It started with a simple question. Carter, standing tall in his neatly pressed suit, addressed the court about the case at hand. But before he could finish his sentence, the judge cut him off with a smirk. "Detective Carter," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Are you lost?" "Because last time I checked, detectives don't lecture in my courtroom." A few muffled chuckles echoed through the room. Carter clenched his jaw but kept his composure. He wasn't one to be rattled easily, but he knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about the case. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. He cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'm here because the evidence speaks for itself." The accused. Judge Holloway waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, please. I don't need a detective trying to do my job. Maybe if you were better at yours, we wouldn't have such a backlog of cases." This time, the laughter was louder. Carter's hands curled into fists at his sides. He could feel the stares, the judgment, the mockery. But he refused to back down. She wasn't done yet. "I don't even know why we're wasting time on this," Holloway continued, leaning back in her chair. "A detective like you should stick to the streets. Leave the law to professionals." The meaning behind her words was clear. The message? Even clearer. It was an attack, not just on him as an officer, but as a man, as a black detective who had fought his way through a system that was never built to support him. Carter felt the weight of every injustice he had ever witnessed, but he stood firm. He knew something Judge Holloway didn't. Something that was about to flip this entire situation on its head. Because just 7 minutes later, the woman who sat on that bench with all the arrogance in the world, the woman who had spent years bending the law to her will, was about to hear something she never expected. Something that would send a chill down her spine. Something that would end with her wrists in handcuffs. And when it happened, the entire courtroom would fall silent. But not before one final sound filled the air. The unmistakable click of justice finally catching up to her. The courtroom was still filled with quiet murmurs when Carter took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had dealt with plenty of power-hungry officials before, but Judge Holloway was something different. She didn't just bend the law, she twisted it to serve her own interests, and everyone knew it. The problem was, nobody dared to stop her. Until now, Carter wasn't just there to argue a case. He had come prepared, armed with something stronger than words. Evidence. But he wasn't going to reveal his cards just yet. He needed her to feel untouchable for just a little longer, to keep digging herself deeper into the very hole she thought she could never fall into. Judge Holloway smirked from her bench, clearly enjoying the way she commanded the room. She tapped her gavel lightly, signaling for silence. "Detective Carter," she said, tilting her head. "I'd hate to waste any more of the court's valuable time, so why don't we move this along? Unless, of course, you're struggling to find your words." The courtroom chuckled again, but Carter barely heard it. He focused on the slight arrogance in her voice, the way she sat back in her chair, completely sure of herself. He had spent months piecing together the truth about her, And now, standing in the very room where she had passed countless unfair rulings, he was finally going to see justice catch up to her. The defendant in the case, a local businessman named Richard Hale, shifted nervously in his seat. He wasn't just any defendant. He was one of Judge Holloway's special cases, the kind that always seemed to slip through the cracks. Arrested multiple times for fraud, bribery, and embezzlement, yet never convicted. The kind of man who had connections. And today, Carter suspected, those connections were sitting at the judge's bench. Hale's attorney, an expensive-looking man in a tailored suit, stood up. "Your Honor, I believe this is a waste of time. Detective Carter's testimony is nothing but speculation. If he has any actual evidence, he should present it now or step aside." Holloway nodded, a slow, amused smile stretching across her face. "That's an excellent point. Detective, do you have anything real to present to this court? Or are we done here?" Carter met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin file, holding it just tight enough for the judge to notice. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly masked it. She didn't know what was in the file, but something about the way Carter held it made her uneasy. He placed it on the table in front of him, but didn't open it yet. Instead, he let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. "This case isn't just about Richard Hale," he said. His voice was calm, steady. "It's about a pattern. A pattern of cases that have all ended the same way, under your ruling, Your Honor." The room shifted. The energy changed. Even the clerk stopped typing. Judge Holloway's fingers twitched slightly on the gavel, but she let out a small, dismissive laugh. "Are you implying something, Detective?" Carter tilted his head, choosing his words carefully. "I don't think I need to imply anything. The records speak for themselves." He flipped the file open. Several documents, signed rulings, and financial reports lay neatly inside. From his pocket, he pulled out a small flash drive and held it up. "This contains direct evidence, bank transactions, phone records, and conversations linking Richard Hale's financial dealings to an unnamed account. An account that has been traced back to someone sitting in this courtroom." The tension thickened instantly. Judge Holloway's face remained composed, but Carter caught the flicker of something behind her eyes. It was the same look he had seen in countless criminals when they realized they were running out of places to hide. Hale shifted in his seat again, his fingers gripping the edge of the defense table. His attorney whispered something urgently to him, but Hale barely reacted. His attention was locked on the judge. Carter saw it. The way the accused looked at her, the way she avoided his gaze. That was all he needed. Judge Holloway tapped her gavel once, forcing a smile. "Detective, unless you have actual proof that directly ties me to anything illegal, I suggest you tread carefully." Carter didn't smile back. "I always tread carefully," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling for a moment before tapping the screen. The courtroom speakers, usually used for witness testimony, crackled to life. And then a voice played through them. A voice that sent a ripple of shock through the room. It was Judge Holloway's. Her own words, captured in a conversation she never thought would be heard in public. And as her voice filled the courtroom, every pair of eyes turned toward her. She didn't move. For the first time, the judge who had humiliated so many sat completely silent. But the real fallout hadn't even begun yet. The courtroom was dead silent, except for the voice playing through the speakers. Judge Holloway's voice, calm, confident, and damning. "Don't worry about it, Richard. You know how this works. The paperwork will be handled, and this case will disappear like the others. Just make sure the deposit comes through by Friday." A sharp inhale cut through the silence. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Did she really just?" But no one dared to finish the sentence. Carter didn't look away from the judge. He studied her face, watching for cracks in her composure. And there they were. Small, but there. The stiffness in her jaw, the way her grip tightened around the gavel, the way she blinked twice, like she was recalculating her next move. Holloway cleared her throat, forcing a laugh. "Detective, I hope you're not seriously presenting an out-of-context recording as some kind of evidence. Anyone can splice together audio clips." Carter expected that response. He didn't react, didn't even let the corner of his mouth twitch. Instead, he pulled out another document from his file. He stepped toward the court clerk's desk and handed it over. "This is a verified transcript of the full conversation. If the court would like to compare it with the unedited recording, I have that too." The timestamps match bank transactions from Richard Hale's company to an offshore account. Richard Hale shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Carter didn't look at him, but he could feel the man's panic radiating from across the room. Judge Holloway tilted her head, her smirk still there, but something had changed. "Detective, do you really think you can come into my courtroom and throw around accusations without consequences?" Carter let the question hang for a moment before answering. "I think I can do a lot more than that." The room held its breath. And then, from the back of the gallery, another voice spoke. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to request an immediate review of this evidence." Carter turned slightly to see Assistant District Attorney Lisa Grant standing near the bench, holding her own folder of documents. He had spoken to her before today, but she had stayed quiet until now. Judge Holloway tapped her nails against the gavel, her smirk on. "That won't be necessary." But Lisa wasn't backing down. "Actually, I think it is." She stepped forward, her voice steady. "Because this isn't just about Richard Hale. It's about the dozens of cases that have passed through your courtroom. Cases that had unusual rulings. Cases that detectives like Carter flagged but were dismissed under your authority." Holloway's jaw tightened. "You're accusing a sitting judge of corruption based on an audio recording and a few documents. That's ridiculous." Lisa met her gaze without flinching. "Then you won't mind an independent review, will you?" Holloway didn't answer. The walls were closing in. Carter could see it, feel it. But he also knew she wasn't the type to surrender without a fight. She had built her career on power, intimidation, and knowing exactly how far she could push the system before it pushed back. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Detective Carter, I hope you're ready for what comes next. Because this is slander, and I have the authority to hold you in contempt of court." Carter didn't flinch. He had been expecting this. "That's fine. You do what you have to do." Lisa stepped closer. "Actually, Your Honor, given the nature of these allegations, we may need to temporarily suspend your authority over this case until a full review is conducted." For the first time, Holloway's mask cracked. It was barely visible, just a flicker of something behind her eyes. But Carter saw it. She knew she was losing control. Hale's attorney suddenly stood. "Your Honor, my client would like to." "Sit down," Holloway snapped. Her voice was sharper than before, the cracks in her confidence now obvious. But it was too late. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. They weren't just here for show. They were waiting, watching. Carter glanced at the clock. 7 minutes. 7 minutes since Holloway had humiliated him in front of the entire courtroom. 7 minutes since she had tried to crush him with her authority. And now she was running out of moves. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The real fight was just beginning. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Every eye was on Judge Holloway, waiting to see her next move. Carter stood still, his expression unreadable. But inside, he knew this was the moment everything shifted. Judge Holloway gripped the gavel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "This is absurd," she said, her voice forced and controlled. "You think you can waltz in here with a recording and a few bank statements and take me down? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Carter didn't blink. "I think you're the one who should be asking that question." For the first time, Richard Hale, the businessman at the center of this mess, leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. The attorney's face turned pale. He whispered back, but Hale was already shaking his head. Whatever was said between them, it wasn't good news for Holloway. Lisa Grant, the assistant district attorney, stepped forward again. "Your Honor, I have just spoken with my office, and we are preparing to move forward with an official investigation. But given the nature of this situation, we need to make sure there's no interference with the proceedings." A muscle in Holloway's jaw twitched. "Interference?" she repeated, almost laughing. "What exactly do you think I'm going to do?" Lisa's voice was steady. "That's not for us to decide. That's for the system to decide." The two uniformed officers near the door took a step closer. Holloway noticed. She set down her gavel, slow and deliberate, but her entire body was rigid. "Detective Carter," she said, her tone shifting from anger to something dangerously calm, "I've seen men like you before. You think because you put on a badge, you can challenge people in power. You think you're untouchable. But let me tell you something." She stood, hands flat on the bench, eyes locked on him. "People like me don't lose." The courtroom was so quiet that the faint hum of the overhead lights felt deafening. Carter's patience was wearing thin. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Hale, his voice low and firm. "Enough riddles. You wanted a deal. Start talking." Hale swallowed hard. He glanced at Lisa, then at the agent, and finally at Carter. His hands trembled as he exhaled. "The Attorney General isn't the only one involved," he admitted. "There are others. Judges, politicians, law enforcement. People you wouldn't believe." Holloway was never at the top. She was just the one willing to take the fall if things went bad. Lisa clenched her jaw. And now that she's gone, they're going to cover their tracks. Carter could see it now, the bigger picture snapping into place. Holloway wasn't running just to save herself. She was running because she knew too much. And the people she had worked for, they weren't going to let her talk. A sudden chill settled over the room. Even with the dim red emergency lights still flickering, everything felt darker. The federal agent turned to Lisa. "We need to move fast. If what he's saying is true, we're looking at a system-wide cover-up." Carter stood, his mind already calculating the next steps. "Then we need to make sure she has nowhere to run. Freeze her assets. Flag her passport. Make it impossible for her to disappear." Lisa nodded. "And we start digging into everyone connected to her. If this goes as deep as Hale says, we don't stop until we find them all." Hale let out a bitter laugh. "You really think you can take them down?" He shook his head. "They've been running this game for decades. You think one judge getting caught is going to change that?" Carter looked him dead in the eye. "Maybe not, but it's a start." For the next several hours, the courthouse remained on lockdown. Investigators combed through security footage, traced Holloway's possible escape routes, and questioned every witness. But as Carter had suspected, she had vanished without a trace. By morning, the case had already hit the news. Reporters were camped outside the courthouse, demanding answers. The corruption scandal was bigger than anyone had realized, and now it was out in the open. There was no hiding it anymore. Lisa walked up to Carter, exhaustion clear on her face. "They're asking if we have a statement." Carter looked past her, out the window at the cameras flashing. He thought about Holloway, about the people pulling the strings, about the fight still ahead. Then he took a deep breath. "Tell them this is just the beginning." Lisa nodded, then turned to address the press. Carter didn't stay to watch. Instead, he stepped away, pulling out his phone. There were calls to make, leads to follow. Holloway might have escaped, but she wasn't untouchable. And one way or another, he was going to find her, because whatever was coming next was bigger than all of them. Carter could feel it. The shift. The moment when everything they thought they knew cracked wide open. Judge Holloway wasn't just corrupt. She was a piece of something much bigger, something they hadn't even begun to understand. Lisa Grant stepped toward Richard Hale, her voice sharp. "You want a deal. Then start talking." Hale swallowed hard. His hands were still raised, as if he thought someone might drag him away at any moment. "It's not just her," he said, his voice shaking. "She's a part of it, yeah, but the real power, the real decisions, they come from higher up." Carter's pulse quickened. "How high?" Hale licked his lips. He hesitated, then looked straight at the federal agent. "The Attorney General." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs. Someone in the back whispered, "No way." Lisa's entire body stiffened. "That's impossible." Hale shook his head. "You think Holloway was making these calls on her own. You think I was the only one paying her off." His voice rose slightly, frantic now. "This runs all the way up. Every case she fixed, every ruling she changed, it was all connected. I was just one of the players. The real power was the man pulling the strings from above." Judge Holloway exhaled, shaking her head as if she had expected this all along. "And there it is," she murmured. "The moment you realize just how deep this hole goes." Carter felt his stomach twist. He had been so focused on taking Holloway down, so convinced she was the mastermind, that he hadn't considered the possibility that she was just another pawn. Lisa turned back to Holloway, her expression unreadable. "If this is true, then you were never in control. You were just following orders." Holloway let out a dry laugh. "Does that make it better?" The federal agent pulled out his phone. "We need to escalate this immediately," he muttered. "If the Attorney General is involved." But he never got to finish. Because in that exact moment, the lights in the courtroom flickered. A sharp buzz filled the air, and then suddenly, darkness. For a single frozen second, there was nothing but silence. Then chaos. Voices shouted over each other. A chair scraped. A heavy thud. The unmistakable sound of footsteps moving fast. Carter's instincts kicked in immediately. He reached for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, the emergency lights flickered back to life. Dim red glows filled the room, casting long, eerie shadows. And Holloway was gone. Lisa spun around. No way. Carter's heart pounded. The two uniformed officers who had been standing near the door were slumped over, unconscious. A back door, previously unnoticed, hung open, swinging slightly as if someone had just rushed through it. Lisa cursed under her breath. She planned this. Richard Hale was still in his seat, frozen in place, looking like he had just seen a ghost. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If she's gone, it means they're coming." Carter didn't like the sound of that. The federal agent was already on his radio. "We have an escaped suspect. Repeat. Judge Amanda Holloway has fled custody. Lock down the building." Carter looked at Lisa, his mind racing. Holloway was corrupt, yes, but she had just revealed something much bigger. And if she had planned her escape, then that meant she still had power. Connections. People on the outside who were helping her. Hale turned to them, his face pale. You think this is bad? You have no idea what's coming next. Carter's jaw clenched. The case wasn't over. It was just beginning. Carter's heart was pounding, but his mind stayed sharp. The second Holloway disappeared, the entire case had changed. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about power, the kind of power that didn't just sit in a courtroom, but reached into places most people never even saw. Lisa was already moving. Lock the exits, she ordered one of the officers who was still conscious. No one leaves this building until we find her. The federal agent was barking orders into his radio, but Carter knew Holloway was gone. She had planned this too carefully. Someone had cut the power at just the right moment, created just enough confusion for her to slip away. And now she was out there, free, with more secrets than they could count. Hale was still in his seat, gripping the table like it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. His face had lost all color. You don't get it, he whispered again. If she's running, it's because she knows what's coming next. And that means we don't have much time. Carter held her gaze. Maybe not before, but today is different. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. This time, a man in a dark suit entered, his badge flashing at his hip. Federal. The moment Holloway saw him, Carter caught it. The flicker of fear, the realization that this wasn't just courtroom drama anymore. This was real. The federal agent, a man with a sharp gaze and an air of authority, walked straight to Lisa Grant and whispered something in her ear. Lisa nodded, then turned back to the judge. Your Honor, she said carefully, I need to inform you that a warrant has just been issued. For your arrest. A sharp gasp spread through the courtroom like a shockwave. Holloway's face didn't change, but her fingers curled slightly against the wood of her bench. Richard Hale let out a shaky breath. His attorney had gone completely still. Carter knew this was the breaking point, the moment right before everything snapped. But what he didn't know was just how far Judge Holloway was willing to go to stop what was coming next. And by the look in her eyes, he had a feeling they were about to find out. The air in the courtroom felt different now, heavier. The judge who once controlled this space with absolute authority was no longer the one giving orders. She was the one being ordered. Judge Holloway's face remained unreadable, but Carter could see it, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers curled ever so slightly. She wasn't just angry. She was calculating, and that put everyone in the room in danger. The federal agent took another step forward. Judge Amanda Holloway, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and bribery. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people looked shocked. Others exchanged glances as if to say they had suspected this all along. But no one dared to speak. Holloway finally moved. Slowly, she stepped out from behind the bench, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor. She didn't look at the agent or the officers. She looked directly at Carter. You really think this is over? She asked, her voice quieter now, almost eerie. You don't understand what you've done. Carter didn't flinch. I think I understand just fine. The agent nodded to the officers. One of them reached for his cuffs. But before he could, Holloway raised a hand. Wait. The room went still again. Even Lisa Grant hesitated. Holloway took another step closer, keeping her voice low but firm. If you arrest me right now, there's something you need to know. Carter's instincts kicked in. He had seen enough criminals try to stall, try to talk their way out of a situation they couldn't escape. But there was something about the way she said it that felt different. Not desperate. Not scared. Controlled. Lisa crossed her arms. Nothing you say will change the fact that we have enough evidence to charge you. Holloway let out a quiet laugh. Evidence? You think this is about evidence?